Hello and welcome back to SIG Mechanics. I'm Edmund, and today I'm releasing a 3-part video series that I wish existed when I was getting acquainted with the P320. When I started out, every time I forgot how to do something, or either to take apart the gun or put it back together, I had to find a forum or scrub through an entire video to find one particular part or piece of information. So it could take me anywhere between 15 minutes or half an hour to find the information I needed. So in this video, I'm not only going to be disassembling the P320 into its smallest possible component, but I'm also going to be presenting the information in a way that can be indexed, like how someone might read a textbook. I'll have a complete table of contents, and you'll be able to find, within 60 seconds or less hopefully, the chapter of the video corresponding to the part or parts you need the information for. The 3 videos are going to be in-depth on the slide, the FCU, and the grip. Each part will have a chapter searchable in the comment section. I will also be providing you with the part's name and corresponding original 6 Sauer part number displayed on the screen for easy ordering if you need it. Before I start this video, I'm going to be dismantling the P320 full size into its absolute smallest components, meaning I'll be going far beyond a general field strip. A disclaimer here, I'm not a gunsmith or an armorer, and failing to understand what you're doing could result in malfunctions, injuries, or at the very least, lost parts. So if you're unsure about anything here, I recommend that you see a professional who can either do the work for you or provide an extra level of guidance as you proceed. This video is dedicated to the FCU. In front of you are all 20 components that make up the FCU. Let's begin. The tools required for the deconstruction of the P320 FCU are a fine-tipped pick or tool, a 3 30-seconds pin punch, a 5 30-seconds pin punch, a armorer's block, and a small hobbyist hammer. To remove the trigger, you need to remove the trigger bar and the trigger bar spring as an assembly. The easiest way to start is to lift the rear portion of the trigger bar and have it sit on the ledge of the SEAR housing. Once that's done, you've created an angle that changes the geometry at the joint between the trigger bar and the trigger. At this point, you can, while holding the trigger bar in place, lift and remove the trigger. With the trigger bar still sitting on top of the SEAR housing, the trigger bar spring now wants to push the trigger bar up. At this point, the tension is pretty much relieved, so you can put a finger at the rear end of the trigger bar as a pivot point and rotate the trigger bar 180 degrees to this point, then unhook the trigger bar spring from the FCU frame. You are left with this assembly. To remove the spring, simply just tilt the spring at 90 degrees, and the little leg that's at the top of the spring will come out of the through hole in the trigger bar. Locate the slide lock pivot pin, and you can use a 5 30-seconds pin punch if you like to push the pin out of the frame from right to left. Keep a finger above the joint between the slide lock itself and the pin, as there is a spring trying to push up on the slide lock. Push the pin through. Take the slide lock by the wings and gently lift it up. Grip the spring and the post separately and pry the 2 components apart. Remove the trigger stop pin by using your 3 30-seconds pin punch and pushing the pin right through. Locate the takedown lever on the left-hand side of the FCU frame. You will be trying to separate the head of the lever from the ledge here on the FCU frame. Push the lever as far down as it will go, and if it does not clear the frame, force with your fingers down the lever to the other end of the frame. While this lever is diagonal, turn your attention over to the rear of the FCU inside this cutout slot. Here is the takedown lever's spring. You want to put a fine tip tool such as this as far in front of the spring as possible and compress the spring back while simultaneously pulling up on the body of the takedown lever. As you can see, this leg or post was inserted in front of the spring. You effectively compressed the spring to get it out of the way and pulled the lever out. Locate the safety lever pin. The safety lever pin is the one with the largest head and the widest diameter. To remove the pin, you can use a 5/32 pin punch if you have it. Insert the pin punch on the opposite end of the FCU and begin pushing the pin out. Keep a finger on top of the SEAR housing's components so they don't spring out. Before we begin, locate the SEAR pivot pin that's located above and in front of the safety lever pivot pin. At this stage, you can remove the pin punch while holding the components inside the FCU's SEAR housing in place. Use a 3/32 pin punch and begin pushing the pin from the right to the left. Keep in mind that removing the pin punch at this point will release all the internals of the SEAR housing. Keep a finger above all the components, remove your pin punch, and let the components fall out of the housing. Locate the SEAR housing roll pin, which is located at the rear of the FCU frame. Use an armorer's block, a hobbyist hammer, and a 3/32 pin punch for this part, and punch the pin right through the frame. With the SEAR housing roll pin now removed, you can separate the SEAR housing from the FCU frame. To do so, lift the housing and pull it back as far back as you can before tilting it at an angle to clear the overstop bar. Then pull the full assembly out of the frame. Locate the trigger bar disconnect on the right-hand side of the SEAR housing. The trigger bar disconnect sits inside a slot that's molded into the housing. Simply just pull the disconnect off of the housing. Locate the takedown lever's spring, and with a fine tip tool, simply insert the tool through the body of the spring and pull out. It should come right off. The SEAR housing and the FCU frame are now completely stripped. Take your stripped SEAR housing and your takedown safety lever spring and locate the slot on the left-hand side of the housing. Insert the spring and press fit it into the slot. Take the housing and your trigger bar disconnect and install it on the vertical slot located on the right-hand side of the housing. Take the SEAR housing and insert it into the FCU frame at a 45-degree angle so that you can clear the magazine stop bar. Begin by controlling the movement of the housing with your fingers and try to line up the hole in the rear end of the FCU with the hole on the internal portion of the housing. Insert your pin. Make sure you have equal distance on both ends of the FCU frame. Begin by identifying the through hole in the safety lever in which the pin in the very next step will go into. This is critical before you proceed. To install the safety lever, rotate your FCU frame so it's resting on its right-hand side. You will now loosely place the safety lever inside the housing. If you have one, use a 5/32 pin punch and try to line up the holes through the frame, the housing, and the lever. Pull out your guide. Install your safety lever pivot pin through the holes you lined up. Turn your attention to the SEAR. Begin by locating the 2 pins to which these springs will go into. Take your springs and gently press fit them into the pins. Note inside the housing a stamped slot. These respective slots are where the 2 SEAR springs will slide into when you're putting it back into the housing. To place the SEAR into the housing, simply slide it with the springs as closely to the rear of the SEAR housing as you can. And notice that without the supporting SEAR pivot pin, the SEAR right now sits loose. The SEAR pivot pin is installed from left to right. Locate the through hole for the SEAR pivot pin right above and in front of the safety lever pivot pin. If you have a tool for it, you can use a 3/32 pin punch. Begin by lining up the SEAR with the hole in the body. Now begin inserting the pin. Once the pin has gone most of the way through, it might be necessary to finish the pin by a small hammer. The pin head sits flat on the left and protrudes a little bit on the right. Note the leg protruding out the rear of the takedown safety lever. To install it, place the frame on its right-hand side and place the takedown safety lever diagonally through the body of the FCU frame. The leg that we mentioned earlier sits on top of and ready to be inserted into the slot where you see the takedown safety lever spring. For this next part, you're going to need a fine-tipped tool. Insert the tool as far in front of the spring as you can and begin compressing the spring towards the rear of the FCU. While doing that compression, you're going to fit the leg in front of the spring and then push down on the takedown safety lever. Note that the takedown safety lever is still partially at an angle. It's prevented from lifting through this lip here, and this could be bypassed by simply press fitting the takedown safety lever up towards the left-hand side of the frame. Insert the trigger stop pin from left to right. It belongs in the smaller diameter hole where the takedown safety lever is. Just a note that sometimes the pin is very loose fitting within this hole and sometimes it's very tight. If it's loose fitting, you may opt to install the trigger stop pin at the very end of your rebuild. Turn your attention over now to the slide lock pin and corresponding post. Just a quick note that one side of the post has a small diameter pin, and the opposite side is a larger diameter pin. To insert the post into the spring, make sure that the larger diameter face goes into the spring. Once placed, you can press fit the post into the spring. Take the post and insert it into the bottom through hole on the slide lock. Take the slide lock lever and place it into the FCU frame, whereas the wings of the lever obviously fit within the notches in the frame. The slide lock lever pin gets installed from left to right. Locate the hole to which the pin will fit through and place a finger to compress the spring that we recently inserted on the slide lock lever. Once the holes are lined up, insert the pin and push it all the way through. The pin head should lay flat against the left side of the FCU frame. Locate the leg on one end of the trigger bar spring and note the hook on the opposite end. Also locate the through hole on the rear end of the trigger bar itself. Take your trigger bar spring, insert the leg through the through hole and drop it down 90 degrees and let the trigger bar spring float within the through hole. Take your trigger bar and trigger bar spring assembly and press your thumb up against the joint between the two components. This will hold the spring steady. Locate the through hole at the rear end of the FCU and place the hook end from the back of the through hole and rotate your trigger bar and trigger bar spring 180 degrees so it rests forward. Take your trigger bar and try to sit this leg of the trigger bar on top of this housing. Note the pin in the trigger and the through hole in the trigger bar. Also note that the leg of the trigger bar is sitting on top of the housing still. And a word of advice, you may need to move the leg to behind the SEAR housing depending on the trigger you have. Different triggers have different geometries cut into them, so the through hole might need to be pushed back or sit forward like it is now, depending on the geometry of the trigger shoe. Insert the trigger through the FCU and try to merge the pin through the through hole in the trigger bar. If it doesn't immediately drop into place, manipulate the trigger bar with your fingers to move the through hole around enough so it meets with and joins the pin. Once they merge, double check that the trigger has gone all the way through the FCU and make sure that the pin on the other side sits relatively flush with the FCU frame. At this point, you're going to push the trigger back and at the same time grip the rear of the trigger bar and manipulate it so that it now falls into the SEAR housing as opposed to sitting on top of it. You may need to lift and move the rear end slightly to allow that merger to happen. Once the trigger goes all the way back, release and check for function. Assure that the SEAR drops and the safety lever rises. And you've now installed the trigger. Thanks for watching part 2 of 3 in the complete disassembly and reassembly of the P320's FCU. I'm going to be leaving you with a real-time timed video of the complete process from disassembling to reassembly because as I completed these videos, I realized that 20-minute videos with explanations as I go through each and every step might make people think that the process might be a lot harder than it actually is. So I'm going to just leave you guys with this video so you can see that anybody can do this. I also want to take the opportunity to say thanks to all of those who subscribed to the channel and to those who left positive comments and liked the videos. I feel like there's a want or a desire for this type of information, so I'm going to keep on providing it. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, and if anything piques your interest, please leave a comment. If you want to see something that you think may be interesting, let me know, and I may just make a video for it. I appreciate your support. Stay tuned for part 3 of 3, in which I will be disassembling and reassembling the P320 grip.